Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to the Great War. At the start of the 20th century, Persia, modern-day Iran, was at the center of an imperial power struggle between Britain and Russia, known as the Great Game in English, and to the Russians as Vojna Tenier, the Shadow War. For the most part, both sides ignored the interests of Persian nationalists, but growing tensions and the disruption of the First World War would change all of that in 1921. In this episode, we'll take a look at events in Persia leading up to a dramatic coup d'etat that happened exactly 100 years ago. Persia had a highly decentralized state, based nominally around the power of the Shah in Tehran, who since 1789 came from the Qajar dynasty of rulers. In reality, numerous tribal leaders enjoyed a great degree of autonomy and often possessed the most competent military forces in the country. This fractured internal political landscape limited the development of the state and made it easier for foreign powers like Britain and Russia to intervene and exert their influence. British Viceroy of India and later Foreign Minister Lord Curzon recognized the strategic importance of Persia in the struggles between the imperial powers. Persia is one of the pieces on a chessboard, upon which is being played out a game of domination of the world. Britain was mostly interested in protecting its interests in the southern part of the country, since the Persian Gulf was along the vital sea lanes to India. Russia wanted influence in northern Persia to secure its borders and be in a position to threaten Britain's communication with its Asian empire. However, both sides were hesitant about open warfare and concentrated on extending their influence instead. This often involved economic concessions, like contracts for transport, construction, mining, and in the banking sector. The British used their global commercial dominance to influence and sometimes bribe Persian leaders to adopt policies that were useful for Britain. On the ground, though, Russia had an advantage. The Russian-led Persian Cossack Brigade, one of the few effective military formations that was loyal to the Shah. The Persian Cossacks protected the Shah from internal threats, which meant that he would also be well disposed to Russian wishes. But things would change at the start of the 20th century. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 and subsequent revolution in Russia weakened their influence in Persia. And the growing threat of Germany in Europe motivated both the British and the Russians to find a compromise to their problems in Asia. This resulted in the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which divided Persia into British, Russian, and neutral zones of influence. As usual, the Shah was not consulted. So on one hand, it seemed like the Great Game had ended in a kind of draw in 1907. Britain and Russia had each gotten what they wanted and could now concentrate on threats closer to home. But many people in Persia had other ideas. While Britain and Russia were burying the hatchet and dividing Persia between themselves, a local movement for democratic reform began to rise. It culminated in the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, an event that was motivated by Persian opposition to foreign influence, especially economic concessions. Secular moderates, merchant guilds, religious leaders, and a fledgling free press all came together in a rare display of unity against foreign influence. Persian ambassador to Italy and revolutionary Melville Khan explained how religious leaders were able to accept the revolution's political ideas. We have found that ideas which were by no means acceptable when coming from your agents in Europe were accepted at once with greatest delight when it was proved that they were latent in Islam. I can assure you that the little progress which you see in Persia and Turkey is due to the fact that some people have taken European principles and instead of saying they come from England, France, or Germany, they have said, "We have nothing to do with Europeans, but these are the true principles of our religion, which have been taken by Europeans." That has had a marvelous effect at once. The Shah was under pressure and no longer had the strong Russian support that he'd relied upon in the past. He therefore agreed to the demands of the revolutionaries to create a new legislative body called the Majlis. This parliament would be led by a prime minister and would approve any major decisions by the Shah, especially economic concessions. Revolutionaries were also able to force out the old Shah in 1909 and install the teenaged Ahmad Shah in his place. For some critics, like secular journalist Ziya al-Din Tabatabai, this was how things should be done. People should choose a person as the king to protect their rights and defend their interests. Hence, the king is the people's representative. He should remain king as long as he gives his service to the people. If the king turns careless and lascivious, the people should remove him from the throne and appoint another one. However, Russia had been weakened, but it was not out of the game entirely. In 1908, the Majlis was temporarily suppressed by the Persian Cossack Brigade, and in 1911 was further restricted under more Russian threats. While revolution raged in Persia and the Russians intervened, the British, in the words of one historian, did little more than sit back and, quote, wring their hands. Even though large deposits of oil had been discovered in Persia in 1908. So the constitutional revolution of 1906 had been partly muted by the Russians while the British looked on. But the outbreak of the Great War in 1914 would upend the situation, and although Persia was not directly involved, it became a strategic battlefield. During the World War, the Persian front was active for 4 years. Ottoman troops and tribal forces organized by Wilhelm Wasmus, the so-called German Lawrence of Arabia, hoped to move through Persia and put pressure on Russia. Russian and British forces, which included the British South Persian Rifles as of 1916, tried to stop them and threaten eastern Anatolia. The fighting was on a smaller scale than the main fronts of the war, but nonetheless had a devastating impact on the country. The young and indecisive Shah proved powerless to assert Persian sovereignty and relieve the sufferings of his people from a terrible famine that broke out in 1917. The famine killed 100,000 people and caused 10,000 villages to be abandoned. The royal government's inability to end the starvation and death sweeping the land further eroded the central authority of the Persian state, and some tribal leaders announced their autonomy. To add to the chaos, the Russian Revolution of 1917 complicated the situation even more. The new Bolshevik government took the country out of the war and renounced imperial Russian policies, and now sought to make friendly contact with pro-Bolshevik groups in Persia. So the Great War had come to Persia and left death and destruction in its wake, and it had also removed the traditional Russian presence in the region. Britain was now the only foreign power in Persia, but it wasn't quite sure what it wanted. After the war, some British ministers like Lord Curzon strongly advised seizing the initiative and doubling down on British economic and political control, if necessary, by sending troops. Only this, they said, could secure Persia as a buffer state between Bolshevik Russia and British interests in the Middle East and India. Other members of cabinet disagreed and wanted to withdraw the soldiers who were already in Persia. They argued that Britain could simply no longer afford the cost of controlling Persia, especially with more pressing problems elsewhere, like in Ireland, Turkey, Iraq, and India. Despite the opposition, Curzon continued to press his case. He was so convinced of his cause that he once chaired a meeting of the Eastern Committee at which he was the only person in attendance. His report of the session concluded, quote, "The committee agreed with the chairman." By August 1919, Curzon's view had begun to prevail, and he had developed a new treaty to propose to the Shah. The Anglo-Persian agreement aimed to extend British influence on a previously unprecedented scale. Britain would gain nominal control of Persia's armed forces, including the Persian Cossack Brigade, as well as national finances and railways, plus access to oil. When asked how the Persians would ever accept such a deal, Curzon simply replied, "The case will be settled by cash." And that is nearly how it worked out. The British provided a bribe of nearly £131,000 sterling to key Persian ministers, who promised to make sure that the agreement would be ratified. But Curzon had underestimated the degree of Persian opposition. Persian constitutionalists were outraged by the deal, especially because the Majlis had not been consulted, even though the parliament had not sat since 1915. The tribes were also unhappy, and in the summer of 1920, 2 autonomous regions were declared in the country: a short-lived democratic state in Iranian Azerbaijan and a Bolshevik-supported Persian Socialist Republic in Gilan. The Bolshevik capture of the White Russian naval flotilla at Enzeli in May, which at the time was under British protection, further eroded British prestige and power in Persia. So the Anglo-Persian agreement had given the British a free hand in the country on paper, but the reality was messier. And the timing was also bad, because the British at this time were imposing themselves in nearby Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and many Persians feared that their country would be next. The Shah's government appointed several prime ministers in succession, but because of opposition to the agreement with the British, especially from the free press, the treaty was not formally adopted. But the British didn't feel the need to wait for the Persian government and began to implement some provisions of the agreement themselves. And this included replacing the Russian officers of the Persian Cossack Brigade with British ones. This was key to enforcing their policy, as British Minister to Persia Herman Norman explained. The expulsion of Russian officers and virtual control by British officers of the only regular military force in Persia would make us practically independent of the vagaries of Persian internal politics, and in the absence of external developments, ensure gradual execution of the 1919 agreement. The process of securing British predominance in Persia was entrusted to Major General Edmund Ironside, who was sent to Persia in the fall of 1920 with orders to keep things under control. Although he lacked detailed instructions, Ironside quickly got involved in local politics and replaced the Russian commander of the Persian Cossack Brigade with a candidate of his own, a man by the name of Reza Khan. Reza was an orphan from a modest background, but he had risen through the ranks after joining the Persian Cossacks back in 1878. To Ironside, Reza was a man that the British could do business with. Reza Khan seemed to me a strong and fearless man who had his country's good at heart. On his own initiative in early 1921, Ironside told Reza that the British would not oppose any initiative by the Persian Cossack Brigade to overthrow the government. Just a few days later, on February 20th, Reza went into action and the coup d'etat began. He led a force of some 2,500 Cossacks on a nighttime march into Tehran, where they deposed Prime Minister Fatollah Khan Akbar. The powerless Shah Ahmad, on the other hand, was allowed to retain his crown, for now. The local police, which was made up mostly of Swedish officers, was ordered to stay in its barracks by the Cossacks, and the coup was a largely bloodless success. Now, there has been some debate amongst historians about the true role of British influence in carrying out the coup. At the time, Ironside clearly felt that he was responsible for it. I fancy that all the people think that I engineered the coup d'etat. I suppose I did, strictly speaking. On the other hand, some have argued that Britain's government was surprised by the coup and that it would have happened even without Ironside's help. What is clear is that the British did provide military and covert political assistance. So a British-supported coup had done away with the old Persian government, and Zia al-Din Tabatabai was sworn in as Prime Minister on February 22nd. The new Persian government did not support the Anglo-Persian agreement, and instead adopted very different policies, much to the chagrin of the British. Al-Din had promised land reform and national independence, and his priority was making a deal with the Bolsheviks, not the British. The Russo-Persian Treaty was signed just days after the coup and represented a serious shift in Persian foreign policy away from Britain. Russia and Persia agreed not to intervene on each other's territory and not to allow third parties to use their territory for such interventions. And if ever a foreign power did intervene in Persia, the Red Army was permitted to intervene. This was a direct challenge to Britain and was perceived that way by the British leaders. Curzon was appalled, and he blamed it on a lack of decisive action in the British government. British diplomat Harold Nicolson, on the other hand, had a different interpretation. More serious was Curzon's misconception of the attitude of the average Persian towards Russia and Great Britain. He did not realize it was Great Britain who was regarded as the oppressor and Russia as the potential friend. Reza moved quickly to consolidate and centralize his power. He banned public gatherings, arrested politicians, imposed martial law, and also banned the free press. He also vowed to end foreign influence and tribalism in spite of the help that the British had given him. Our aim is to establish a government that will not plunder the treasury. A strong government that will create a powerful and respected army, because a strong army is the only means of saving the country from the miserable state of its affairs. We want to establish a government that will not discriminate among Gilani, Tabrizi, and Kermani. We want to establish a government that will not be an instrument of foreign politics. Reza also began a campaign to crush the autonomous Gilan Soviet Republic and the tribal leaders that had been supported by Britain. And Reza's alliance with his revolutionary prime minister Zia al-Din Tabatabai lasted less than 100 days. The prime minister wanted to get foreign loans and raise taxes for his plans to develop the country, but Reza opposed him and he resigned in June. And all that remained of the old authority was the powerless young Shah. Just months after the February coup, Reza was now in almost complete control of the country. Reza had plans for him as well, but they would have to wait for another day, when Reza Khan himself would ascend the throne. Now, the Persian coup d'etat of 1921 is not the kind of topic that you'll see covered on many other YouTube history channels. In fact, history is kind of a niche area in YouTube's grand universe, so to speak, and in recent years, the platform hasn't really made it easier for history creators like us to bring you a detailed and hopefully objective version of historic events. That's why we crowdfunded and released our Battle of Berlin documentary, 16 Days in Berlin, specifically outside of YouTube, where 250 of our videos were retroactively demonetized because they changed their rules years after these videos were made. And given this kind of climate, we've taken further steps to be safe in the future. We teamed up with some other creator friends to have a platform where we don't have to worry about YouTube's capricious actions. This platform is called Nebula. On Nebula, you can watch top educational creators like us ad-free and support them at the same time. For example, this video you're watching now doesn't have this very ad on Nebula. And we can publish content there which we can't put on YouTube, like our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin, and we want to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. And you can find all the sources we use for the episode in the video description. And if you want to support our channel, you can do so on Patreon, and the links for that are in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1921, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that fancies that everyone thinks that it engineered a coup d'etat.